Siblings and sisters and brothers, welcome to Tuesdays for Nurture. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Chris Davies, and I'm so glad to be here with all of you today. Tuesdays for Nurture is a webinar series where we faithfully focus on education for the people of God. And as you know, that can include faith-filled politics to interviews of key leaders to how-tos in congregational life and the impacts of all of the reality of now on church life today. All of our webinars will include clear suggestions on what you can do to change the church and the world towards the world God imagines for us. I am so glad today to be here with the Reverend Dr. Aaron Wade, esteemed colleague and coordinator for congregational granting from JLCM at the national setting. Reverend Dr. Aaron is also a church planter himself, so he is well equipped to lead this conversation. And if you are one of these people watching and wondering if God is pulling you in a certain direction to do something new, then in between Aaron and I, we are bound to have a conversation with you at some point. So it's so good to see you in digital space before we connect in one-on-one or however we do in this space. So Aaron, welcome. And I know that you have assembled an incredible team of leaders to carry us through.
Thank you so much, Chris. Let me just say, I'm really excited about today's webinar. We have some exciting content that we want to talk about. And most important, we got some cool folk that we have joining us today. We have some church planners. You know, that's the coolest of cool in the church world. We have some folk who are that are very familiar with the United Church of Christ. Many of you all may know them. And we have some folk who help church planners move forward with statistics, data, as well as making sure that they are successful in their pursuit. So I'm excited about today's webinar. So let me set the stage for today's conversation by just having us think. The church as we know it is changing. It's changing right before our eyes. New churches and reimagining churches, folk who've been in operation for years, but decided that we have to do something different if we're gonna survive, are the true indicators of where we are going as a church. Today, we're gonna hear about new church trends across America. We're gonna hear the stories and experiences of new church planners, and we're gonna connect how they connected to the United Church of Christ. And we hope, my prayer is that it gives us a glimpse of where we are going as a church, a denomination. So without any further ado, I want to introduce to you the esteemed panel that I have with us today. First, I want to introduce Marge Royal, PhD. She's a member of the New Church Development Committee. She's the secretary of that committee in the Central Atlantic Conference, and she's the founder of Clay Pot Research. Marge, can you say hi to everybody for us?
Sure, hi. Clay Pot's research does work with churches and religious bodies and also with healthcare organizations. And you've probably seen a lot of my surveys already, so thanks.
Thank you so much, Marge, for joining us, and thank you for adding to this conversation. We definitely want to hear from you around how the churches in America and even global are having surges and what's happening. The next person I want to introduce is Jason Hubbard. Now, Jason Hubbard, he is a member of the United Church of Christ as well. He's a part of this, the CASA Grant Advocate team. We call him the CASA Grant Advocate himself. And he's a lead pastor of a UCC church in Petaluma, California. Jason, I think you got to unmute yourself. I think you might be muted.
Yeah, there it is. Hey, everybody, really glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. As the grant advocate to the UCC's CASA granting program, I get to speak with new church planters, those who are renewing churches, and people with just extraordinary ideas for how the Spirit might rise in their communities all over the country. And I'm really excited to share some of what I learned by getting to see all of you in action around our denomination.
Thank you so much there, Jason. We also have with us some church planters. As I promised, this is like the icing on the cake. These folk right here, we have Reverend Billy and Reverend Carey. They have been CASA recipients of our CASA grant. They're the founders and co-pastors of Touchstone Community Church in Bernie, Texas. Hey, Billy, can you say hi? And then Carey, can you say hi to everybody for us?
Well, hi, everyone. I'm so honored to be here amongst this company. If you've never heard of Bernie, Texas, it's near San Antonio, Texas. So we're a suburb of that, and we are very happy to be associated with the United Church of Christ. Thank you.
And I'm Carey. Billy and I are just so fortunate to be a part of the United Church of Christ. And Bernie, Texas is in the Hill Country, just a little northwest of San Antonio. And it's so good to have a UCC church in this part of Texas. Really glad to be here.
Thank you, Reverend Billy and Reverend Carey. We also have with us Reverend Rashawn Senaduri. He is the founder and pastor of the Oasis UCC in Jefferson City, Minnesota. And he also has been a recipient of Missouri, my apologies. He's also been a recipient of our CASA grant and a very active church plant here in the United Church of Christ. Reverend Rashawn, can you say hi to everybody for us?
Hi from Jefferson City, Missouri. I'm excited to be here and to join in this conversation. There's so much that we can share.
Thank you so much, Reverend Rashawn. I'm laughing because I always get that. You know, the acronyms, now that we're in COVID mindset, it goes off every now and then. Thank you so much, Reverend Rashawn. I'm also delighted to have with us the Reverend Doctor, also known as Bishop-elect Vanessa Brown. She's pastoring 2 churches. She's the founder and lead pastor of Rivers of Living Water UCC churches located in New Jersey and in New York City. Reverend Dr. Vanessa, can you say hi to everybody for us?
Grace and peace, everyone. So glad to be here with you. I'm excited about this conversation on this afternoon. After pastoring 2 churches, one in New York City for 14 years, the other in New Jersey for 7 years, planting them both, I am happy to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Doctor. I appreciate you and thank you for being here. Now, let's get to why we all are here. Everyone's here salivating, waiting to hear about new churches and how we do what we do. But I want to set the stage with this. Let's make sure that we're all on the same page, because I've heard some things. Some new churches have popped up and folk like, that's not a new church, that's Facebook, or that's not a new church, this is just a book club, or that's having drinks at the bar, that's not a new church. So let's just get an understanding. I want to talk to Jason and Marsh for a brief moment about what is a church plant. How do we determine what a church plant is? How do we configure that, especially in today's time? And I'm going to give a disclaimer. I do understand that over the last 8 to 10 months, we as a nation and world have been going through an unprecedented time with this thing called coronavirus or COVID-19. So even in that, like, does the title of church, everyone that talked about Facebook churches at one point have become a Facebook church. So how do we define what a church plant is, or new church start?
Well, I can tell you we did this study in 2016, and we struggled with that same question. You know, what's a new church? Or is a merged church of 2 existing churches a new church? We didn't think so. The answer we finally decided, the definition for our study was, is this a worshiping community? Maybe not every week, maybe only every month. Maybe it's mostly doing important social service work, but somewhere in there, it's a worshiping community.
Yeah, my sense of that is that I bump into the recurring theme that a church plant takes on that verb. It is something that is gestating and growing. It is a new rising of the Spirit and the expression in the tradition of the life and work of Jesus Christ. And so if that's happening in whatever way you can claim it, then you have something called a church. It may not have a building, but if you've got ministry that's rising in a new community, it's at least worth asking the question, how are we church for yourselves?
Jason, you just said something that shocked me. Hold on. We are the United Church of Christ, and we have 4 different strands that make up who we are, and we have a long history. You're telling me that I can be a church without a building? That's like what makes up a church, right? You got to have a building with a steeple and stained glass windows, right?
Well, that's how I was raised, and those are beautiful places to be, and they're also closing at alarming rates. And so the question then is for folks who may be on this webinar thinking, I'm feeling a calling to something rising within us, and we're not seeing it amidst the voices of our community. How might we make that happen? And I can tell you that I've got folks making a place called church out of their trunks, in closets, in grocery stores. And these are communities of people from two, where two or more are gathered, to hundreds whose life and work is largely on the side of buses traveling down the road in urban Chicago. Add to that the wild world of pandemic and of the real political crisis. There has never been a richer time to see where the Spirit might be moving. There is tremendous opportunity in this moment to ask that question: what is the gospel in this place and this time? And to gather people around to ask you about your sense of it, because it can never be about your better idea. And that's one of the things I see so much is folks get an idea that I'm going to start a church. And the first problem with that is I. Church is always a we rising and a servant kind of moment. And as we ask, how might we be church? That's where we got to begin, is in that gestating question.
Wow, Jason, you're rocking us already at the beginning. We haven't even had a moment to build up. This is good. Marge, you said something. You said that you, in the group that was doing the research, identified a church plant or church start as a place that is a worshiping community. Very broad, very open. Even what worshiping means, that just seems to be, can be broad and open. Can you help us with some of the research that you've done, lay the foundation for us to understand what type of church starts have you all seen out there? Some of the traditional, some out of the box. Can you talk about what are some of the shifts that are happening that you've seen over time, at least between the 20th and 21st century, that's happening between churches and things like that? That would be really helpful.
Sure, I'd love to. The study that I referred to was one that was done by then Center for Progressive Renewal, now Convergence, and it involved 6 denominations, mainline denominations in the US and Canada. And what we did, we really wanted to see whether church was beginning to look different. And it surely was. When we looked at the information, at the data from over 300 churches, we found that the traditional model is represented only about a quarter of those congregations. Another quarter were new immigrant congregations, and they spoke, I think, 40 languages among all of the congregations in the study. The larger group, nearly half of them, were what we called alternative congregations, meeting in different places at different times with creative, often informal worship, and many different models of ministry and outreach, including those forming around specific missions. Some of them were arts emphasis, some were intentionally multi-ethnic, multicultural, welcoming everybody. And I think if we did this study today, that the percentage would be even higher of these alternative congregations. And all, by the way, these alternative congregations were much more likely to include unchurched people and also younger adults. So we really do see those as the wave of the future. But we found out some interesting things about now and in the past. In the past, the church had something called sometimes a helicopter model or a parachute model, where we picked just the right person and we dropped them in just the right setting and expected them to fund a church and be self-sufficient in 3 to 5 years. And guess what? It didn't work. It worked somewhere, but not many places. So looking at it now, we're seeing what didn't work. Churches did not become self-supporting in 3 to 5 years. In the study, about 10 years seemed to be necessary, maybe more. And even then, they were not 300-member churches. Many of them never hoped that they would be. Alternative and new immigrant congregations seemed even slower on this growth curve for various possible reasons. Now, when I asked new church pastors in the Central Atlantic Conference whether being full-time or part-time, half-time at first would be better, the consensus was, let's be half-time at first, so whatever money is available can last longer. And again, they said that this is going to take some time. Secondly, many of the ways we selected to start to get new church pastors were not all that helpful. Self-selected leaders with a passion for ministry at a particular location seemed to be much more important in the study than experience, training, or selection for particular personality traits. We also found that a lot of the outreach activities that were taught as this is the way you start a new church. You get out there and you be known in the community. You give gimmicks out. You just get yourself out there. Didn't seem to be all that helpful either. And I think that may be because some of these alternative churches were not looking at the community as a whole, but at particular segments. So they may have needed to get out in that community. And it's also not all about location. That used to be the story in the 50s and 60s and 70s. You get a new development, you start a new church. Not so much anymore. And I learned this in a different study that we did recently on psychological type in new and established congregations. Now, you may have heard of psychological type as Myers-Briggs, and it categorizes people on dimensions on how they relate to the world around them. The details are not important here, and they'll be in the chat for you to look at the study with more information. But it can be used to divide people into 4 temperaments, what I call traditional, and you kind of know what traditional churchgoers are, innovative or playful, folks that want something different, maybe different every week, intellectual that want to debate theology, and idealistic that say, I want to help people, I want to be in mission. In the American public, about 40% of the people could be put in a traditional category, with 20% each in the other 3 categories. In established churches, however, almost all the attenders in the churches we studied were traditional, over 90 to 95% in most of those churches. In new congregations, however, attenders were much more likely to be divided into all 4 categories, and idealistics were more common in these than in traditional churches. Now, this says to me, location doesn't matter nearly so much, because even if we have a UCC congregation in every town, we're still missing 60% of the population who are of these other 3 kinds of temperaments. So location isn't it anymore. Well, I've mentioned a lot of things that don't work. And you might say, well, all right, what does work? Overall, a few things were important, and you could probably guess what they were. First of all, use of the internet and social media is the way to go these days, and in church planting as well. Second, clergy skills and time spent in outreach and evangelism and skills in public relations were related to numerical growth. So those kinds of particular skills are more important now than ever. In traditional congregations, growth was related to emphasizing programs, activities to make themselves known in the community, and follow-up of guests. And traditional congregations attracted traditional attenders through transfer from other congregations often. Alternative congregations, on the other hand, grew better when they emphasized their differences from traditional and particularly from conservative churches. They were more successful in reaching the unchurched when their pastor was the impetus and came out from that community, so that they had roots in the area. That was helpful. Having a younger pastor and meeting in alternative locations and at alternative times was also helpful. The church as the building was not nearly as important in alternative congregations. And as opposite to traditional ones, extensive follow-up of guests seemed to be counterproductive. People kind of ran away if you asked them too much or too often. New immigrant congregations grew better when they were involved and well-known in those particular immigrant communities, and also when they received support from sponsoring congregations and also from the denomination. Denominational support was helpful in other areas, but when it was not available or other financial resources were not available, a lot of congregations, pastors underwrote the ministry by getting very little or no salary. And this is probably not the healthiest way to start a new church, but it was quite common. Finally, although it's hard to measure in studies like these, maybe what works best depends on the new congregation's specific setting and in its particular ministry goals. New church planters may need to learn not what works in general, but what is the most appropriate for their vision, their mission, their model, and their context, choosing a worship style and programs and outreach activities accordingly. One thing that characterized alternative congregations was how much they did differ from each other. People would say to me, describe one, or describe what an alternative congregation is, and I couldn't do it because there were so many different models. The variety itself may have been important. Or after all this study, sometimes I wonder, maybe it's just the Holy Spirit working in many different ways in many different places. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for that, Marge. I appreciate that. You helped us understand the type of churches, type of new church plants that are happening across America, not just in the UCC, but then you took us specifically to looking at some of our churches in the United Church of Christ. And the beautiful thing that I love about that is that we can see across conferences and associations, there are different things that are happening that are sprouting up as the Spirit is giving utterance. And I'm hoping, as you all know, that we're working on this thing called the Manual on Church. It's going to be a great thing that we hope to come out 4 to 5 years, and we look to address new church starts and church plants during that time and in that document. One of the things you said that I thought was really key, Marge, is that what works best for your community is what you need to focus on. It's good to look at what others have done, what others are doing, looking at research, but what is the Spirit leading you to do to address the need that exists where you are? I think that's powerful. Thank you for sharing how some churches are flourishing. Now, Jason, I want to ask you this. Marge showed us how some churches are flourishing and why some churches are flourishing. I'm going to ask you a different question, but of the same coin. What makes a successful church plant? When we're looking at metrics, how do we determine, is it in how many people come? Is it in how many services you have? What makes a successful church plant? As a church planter, when I first started, I was like, I needed a metric. I need to know if I'm doing good or not. I need to know what I'm going to match myself up against. So what would you say is a metric? What do we do?
That's a really important question, because we are raised up in a culture which has a very particular way of measuring quote unquote success. And what my experience is, and we've got panelists on today, who I think will affirm this, just about every way the culture wants to measure us, which is largely in about measures of popularity or influence. How many people are coming? Do I have resources and assets? Do I have a beautiful space? These are things that in the world of the church of my childhood, 45 years ago, you needed church almost like you needed a driver's license. Everybody sort of had to. The question was not, do you participate in a faith community? It's where do you?
Yeah.
And we don't live in that world anymore. We have Google. You can be anywhere on the planet in just a few moments. Now, that doesn't give you the human community, which is the thing that I think the gospel really calls us to make possible, even if we're doing it over the internet. And how do we answer this question about success in deeply human, spirit-connected terms? And in that way, I ask a lot of church planters, a lot of church renewal folk to answer for me a simple question. And that simple question sometimes takes a year to answer, which is, give me your one sentence understanding of the gospel in your unique context. And if you can do that in a way that has been brought in through, as I did, I've planted more than one church in both very progressive parts of the country and in very conservative parts of the country. The question remains the same. Can you find an answer to this powerful question of how the gospel might become a deeply human and thus connected with the Spirit kind of community? And in that way, I think we need not just success in terms of financial viability or in community impact, which are all important things to measure. They're just no longer the only things we measure and then check the box called, well, successful, great, we're not going to worry about that anymore. We have to ask much more challenging questions now into a world which doesn't need us like a commodity. There's going to have to be a real reason for people to take very real risks to leave their living rooms. Eventually, we'll all be able to do that again. And be in a community doing work that is countercultural by its very definition. And so one of the church plants that I did in Western Michigan involved literally a year of sitting in coffee shops with people, asking them to help me understand what it might look like in a language they would choose, not I'm asking them to affirm. What would it look like for something called church to rise up around you? What would you be empowered and inspired to give your life to? And that really moved my initial inspiration in powerful ways. And I would really recommend to anybody on this call thinking about a new idea for church, whether it's a church plant or a renewing within an existing congregation, or as I've been a part of, nesting a new church idea within an existing older church, which can be a very powerful model. The question remains the same. And I think beyond that question, and I'll hand it back to you for a second here, Aaron, is beyond success, there are some underlying things about, how healthy are we as we are church, that a church cannot be successful without all the pieces of it being well. And that's another real challenge, which maybe we'll leave to another question.
So let me ask this. I heard you say 1 year, being able to answer the question of what is it, how can we have the gospel to live out? How is it that the gospel live out through our church in this community? Then you said 1 year again. Is 1 year that magical number that I've moved from being a new church to an established church? Is that what I hear you suggesting, Jason?
Oh, no. I have very few examples of churches that in a year, and we've got some panelists here who I'm sure will share their insights. A year is about 5 minutes. And maybe after a year, you'll begin to have the first insights as to how one might be able to move along from an idea to something that could be viable, to something that might in fact be sustainable. And I think Marge really points that out, that now we're looking at 10-year timeframes. And again, success may not, that's a measure of financial sustainability. And I am aware of wonderful church ideas that immediately had large infusions of cash, but because the rest of the ministry wasn't well, they burned all that up in fairly short order, and they're not a place called church anymore. So there is a kind of dance that we do between the wellness of your leaders, the continuing empowerment of the people who create a place called church, and a willingness to follow that as a servant rather than focusing it all on what we would like, which is really how the world teaches us to build organizations. I'm going to go out and be an entrepreneur, and it's my better idea out on the frontier. And the world will either love me or hate me. It's Silicon Valley. While I think there are really important lessons to learn from good business insight, my first career was in entrepreneurial business. We wrote a business plan for the first church I planted that was 50 pages long. It took a year and a half to write. Anybody wants that plan, I'd be happy to send it to them. Send me in the chat. I'm sure we can figure it out. But that business plan was only one small portion of a much larger calling to answer that question of how might this thing called the gospel rise up in this unique community? And frankly, as Marge pointed out, many people are not even going to know what you mean by the word gospel. We have to get real humble about it in a time when that's not even a word that makes a lot of sense to many people who might be attracted to a new expression of a place called church. Even the word church is too much for many folk to get over. I'll be interested to hear how the panelists bump into that.
Thank you there, Jason. And that's a great segue. I think you, myself, and all of the folk who are watching and listening are really interested in hearing from the folk who've done this at the ground, the planters, the church planters. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about your experiences. Now, I don't want to have to call on any particular names. As you feel led, raise your hand and let us know that you're going, and then you go ahead and jump in. But let's start with the experience of church planting. I mean, if anyone has ever started anything before, you can only imagine how tough and how hard it is. There's a wisdom saying that says the product that you see, or that which you see, took at least 10 failures before it reached a level of being able to be in front of you. And so I have this question for our church planners today. As you look back over your journey, you've been in existence for at least a year, 2 years, some for 5, some for 10. As you look back over your experience, what supports did you realize were necessary that you received? And then what were those supports that you didn't receive that you felt if you would have had it, it would have helped with helping to move the vision further along? Anyone want to jump in there?
So I think for me, would have been very helpful. So I did this twice. I started off with the New York church, and I wish that I would have had more time to plan. That would have been helpful for the New York church in its first iteration, that we would have had more time, because we've been through many iterations of Rivers of Living Water. But that first time around, I wished I would have had more time to plan and more money. The second time around with the New Jersey church, I had more time to plan, but I still didn't have more money. And remember, I'm doing these things without a denomination. So I just became United Church of Christ 3 years ago. So everything that I was doing was grunt work, was groundwork, was grassroots work. And the money was community money. It was not money that was coming from a denomination. So those are the things that I wish that we would have had, and we could have done a little bit more planning the first time around. I think that what I learned the first time around that I did the second time around was, before I started the church in New Jersey, I sat within community to find out what exactly was needed. And I did community outreach for 1 full year before I even called myself a church, period, right? So we were out there, we were doing what the community said that they needed us to do. But then after that, we decided, and they decided, listen, this is more than community outreach work. We want more of what you're bringing. And so what can we do to have more? And then that's how the New Jersey church was born. But the first time around, I knew what the community needed because I'm actually from that community. However, it still took time, you know what I mean, to grow it. It's like planting in a garden. The seed is dropped. Just because you drop that seed doesn't mean that something is going to come into fruition tomorrow. It's going to take time for it to water. It's going to take time for the sun to come. It's going to take time for it to blossom into the thing that you planted at that time. So.
Thank you there, Bishop. Anyone else would like to share? What were the things that you felt necessary that you either received or you didn't receive, and how important was that? Rashawn?
So the way the Oasis UCC came about was from a split within an existing UCC congregation. And so a lot of the people that formed the Oasis were people from that congregation. And so one of the things that we had to figure out, we needed the time, and we actually had the time, which was good. So we spent a lot of time talking and reflecting and praying, and then trying to figure things out on our own. There wasn't a whole lot really available, say, within our conference and association. And so we were kind of splashing around a little bit at the beginning until we kind of figured out, made some connections with people and started networking, but also connecting with the wider community and figuring out what some of the needs were. And right at the beginning, we had no money. And so money was also a big thing that we really needed at that time. And so a lot of that came from friends and family supporting us and friends of the congregation. And then the conference also was able to provide us with a little bit of funding. And so that helped a great deal. But I think the biggest challenge we had was the people resources of people with ideas and guidance on what each step might look like. And so that was something of a challenge. And one of the godsends for me was probably about 6 months into the process, Chris actually reached out and offered coaching through CPR. And that helped an amazing amount, because I kind of got to the end of my knowledge, I guess. And so that helped me figure out, now, where does this go? How does this this shape into something that can grow? And so that's the important thing, I think. For me, that coaching kind of changed everything.
Thank you for that, Reverend Rashawn. Reverend Billy.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in a little bit on what Vanessa was saying about planning. And Carey and I guess in our hearts, had been planning for a long time, but all of a sudden we found ourselves where the iron was hot. You know, it's like you got to strike while the iron is hot. And our community was primed and ready. And we had some events that launched us. It's like, we got to go now. We got to go right now. And that's when we talked to the Reverend Don Longbottom and Liz Nash, our association minister, and they said, go. And we said, well, we're not even, you know, I wasn't even ordained in the UCC at that time. I was ordained in the Methodist Church, but I was transferring my credentials. Carey was completing hers, but they saw they had a desire for a long time for UCC presence in our conservative town. And we are Bernie, we're not born and bred, but we lived here for like almost 30 years, each of us. And it was just time to go. So we kind of hit the ground running. We have planned as we went. We have learned as we just couldn't wait. It was time to go. Luckily, and it's worked out very well. I know Carey wanted to speak to some denominational support that we had as well. So Carey.
Yeah, I would say I agree with, I agree with what Reverend Brown said and Billy said about time, because we were actually in this process for a very long time, but actually planning for about a year and talking to somebody named Sid Hall, who is with UCC and UMC. And then we moved into, after we had a Pride walk that was, and a worship community, worshiping day afterward, where 70 people, not our friends, we thought just our friends would show up, but 73 people that our friends, most of them couldn't make it. And we realized that moment, that immediacy that Billy spoke of, okay, we got to quit saying, let's keep planning, let's just move. And I want to say we went to, when we realized this faith community couldn't happen in the denomination that we had been ministering for so long, we went to visit the nearest UCC church, Bethany Congregational Church in San Antonio. And we kind of walked in there and said, we need a place to heal. We need a place to grow this ministry in our minds. Here's what we're doing. We're UMC people, if you'll take us. And they not only took us, but I think this is so important for churches, no matter how big, no matter how small, that you embrace folks who come in knowing that they may need you to just be a sanctuary for a while so that you can grow the church elsewhere and help in providing that loving support and encouragement. And that was given to us. We are family. We're different churches. We celebrate our differences, but we love the ministries that we do and how we've helped each other. And it just grew from there, like Billy said, going to Liz and the association. They all embraced and encouraged, seeing that this really was a call for Bernie, and it was a vision. We just keep saying, you know, God was working on it for a very long time, and all the pieces came together. But it really did take the encouragement and the affirmation of the church, the big church, UCC, the local church, UCC, the association. It took all of that for this to happen, and it's just been an amazing ride. We began in a year ago, first Sunday of Advent, our weekly services. We were only meeting for 12 weeks when, you know what happened. And, but we are a strong, vibrant community, and we're growing still in our relationships with one another and our connection to our community. And it's been very wonderful. And of course, I hear money. Of course, money is needed. And we have been so blessed with the CASA grant, which it would have been so, there would have been a lot more, I think, fear and trepidation had we not had that affirmation on top of everything else. So it's been a great time.
Wow. Thank you, Reverend Billy and Reverend Carey. I have to move on for the sake of us making sure we get through the breadth of the conversations that we're having. And I know that there's some other things that folks may want to ask. So let me ask this question. What was that one thing that you feel catapults you to be able to get the momentum to move things forward? If there was one thing, maybe it was two, but what is that thing that helped to really move you? There's people who are starting, who've been in the process of starting, and they're trying to figure out, what do I need to do? What is that one thing that really moved things forward in your ministry?
I know this probably is good. So here is the thing that I want to say. Everything doesn't work for everybody in every space, in every place. Like, we can't generalize this. I think that that's very important for people to hear, right? I am a Black lesbian clergy woman pastoring in an urban neighborhood. That is specific, and it is because the work that I do is specific. I am not a generalist. I'm not a general surgeon. I don't perform all kinds of surgery. I perform a certain kind of surgery through the word of God. I think that's important for me to say. All right. And so let me move on to, what is your question again?
I hear you. You had to get that out. That was burning from the spirit. That was burning.
I needed to say that because I feel like people are going to walk away thinking that they can just do it because, Jason did it this way and Marge has research on this way. And that's not the way it works. I think that when we even talk about location, I think that that's important to talk about because the way I'm pastoring in an urban neighborhood, location is important about where I'm going to go and do this work. And what's important is, who is God calling you to? We are not all called to the same people. Who is God calling you to, and why is God calling you to those people will help you discern where you need to be. But that's not the question you asked me, Aaron.
That was good, though. And I think that's a good pearl of wisdom, because so often we heard Reverend Carey say, we ask folk to come to the table, friends and families. And so often we get disappointed. As a church planner myself, we get disappointed, discouraged because, man, this person didn't show up, that didn't show up. But the Holy Spirit may have a whole nother group of people for you to minister to. And so you have to be very prayerful and discerning. Lord, what is your will for me? God, what is your will for me? The question is, and I think you kind of answered that, Bishop, the question is, what is that thing that moved you forward? And for me, I'm hearing you say that the community, knowing, being clear on what you were called to, who you were called to, was a big part of that. Exactly. And you can add to that if you want to.
No, that's exactly, you summed it up. Like, knowing what I was called to and who I was called to helped to move our ministry forward. It wasn't just me, but we had to recognize, what is it that the people needed? What is it that I'm called to? Who I'm going to be working with? These are the things that moved me forward. Besides the fact that we had a great music ministry too. And people are, in our culture and where we are, people are drawn to music. And so that was also very helpful to us.
Amen. Did anyone else want to speak to that question around what is it that you feel moved you forward to where you are right now? Yes, Reverend Billy.
I agree with Vanessa on that. It was clarity of call. We were clear, the target audience we were called to, predominantly LGBTQ people in a conservative area of town with no place within a 30-mile radius that they could even go to church, as well as the nuns and duns. And so even attending a political rally, I looked around and thought, here are 300 people with no place to be in church, or they are silenced in their churches because of their progressive views. So clarity of call and the needs of the community drove it.
Anyone? Go ahead, Reverend Sean.
And I think that would be the same for us, that clarity of call and that idea that we were not forcing anything on anyone. There was a need in our community for a church or a faith community that was progressive, that was open and affirming. We are the only progressive, open, and affirming church in Jefferson City. And so it was a need that existed. And so that, I think, is what helped us move forward once the word got out that we were there.
Thank you. I'm going to open this question to everyone that's here. Jason, Marge, everyone that's here, you can feel free to answer this question. Just give us a sign to let us know that you're going to jump in so that we're not all jumping in at the same time. What word of encouragement? There are people here who are watching who really have been felt a strong tug, burden, God calling them to do a work. Maybe not 100% clear, maybe not knowing exactly what to do, how to do it, don't have any pieces, because I know that's how I was. And I was hungry. Like, I just want to know, where do I start? What words of encouragement would you offer? We heard pearls of wisdom, but what words of encouragement would you offer for the person that's listening and who feels a strong sense of calling, or a church that wants to support other churches? What word of encouragement? Reverend Carey?
This may sound very simple, but on those days when you feel like, I know it's there, I don't see it exactly how it's supposed to be, don't give up and keep going to people and sharing your call and sharing what's in your mind and in your heart with people of the church, people of the greater church, because I think almost all of us probably had those days where we thought, it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. I'm probably wrong. This is probably not a real call. And so it's really discerning with other people too, and sharing and talking with other people.
Would anyone else offer encouragement? Jason? Reverend Jason?
Yeah, I'll begin with repeating that I really believe that there has not been a more rich and ripe time in our culture's history to be a new version of the church. So take that as encouragement, and also the encouragement to know that my experience, and I think you're hearing it echoed in our other panelists, this is some of the hardest, sometimes most defeating work you can ever attempt to do. That is how it's supposed to be. Because you don't get to be the church, something that powerful in the world, without having to overcome a really long series of challenges to make sure this is really a servant to a community. And so that when you experience those roadblocks, those frustrations, those, as Carey was saying, suggestions that you got it wrong, you probably just ought to walk away. Know that that is the path. That is not a sign that you're not on the path. And take that as encouragement to keep moving forward.
Thank you so much, Jason. Would anyone else? Yes, Reverend Dr. Vanessa.
I think I just would say to people to be very, very prayerful. It takes a wise and sensitive person to realize what God does not want you to do. Right. And so I think that it's imperative that the spirit of discernment starts kicking in, and it increases in your life as you decide what way you and God decide, you, God, and the group that you're working with decide your way forward.
Any others?
I was thinking, as Jason talked about, how hard it is to start a new church. And I absolutely agree from everything I've seen about that. Some of what I've done recently was look at some churches that tried to become new, to model some of the new things that the new churches were doing. And I entitled it, "Can the Leopard Change Its Spots?" And my answer was yes, but it's really hard. And from what I've seen, it's easier to start a new church than to change an established one, to really reach out to new people. Not impossible, but it's difficult. So think about new churches.
That's actually a great opportunity to lift up some of the questions that are coming in along the way, Marge, because my sense from the conversations that are happening alongside is a lot of people are trying to figure out, well, how does this apply to my congregation? Or what are the resources I need to start a church? So I want to lift up a few questions specifically. One is about the age differences that might be part of your church. And I suspect that this kind of interposes with those categories you lifted in at the very beginning, Marge, and the research of what you must do in prepping to plant a church. So how the question for the panelists is tell us a little bit about the age differentiation in your congregations, and what is the research that you did in order to prep for the welcome of those categories?
So, Chris, I'm going to jump in here. I listened to Marge's research too, and one of the things she talked about was younger pastors, and I no longer fit in that category. I'll only speak for myself, not Carey. But I want to say this, and I don't argue the research at all. But one of the things I think matters more than age for the people starting it is relevance. Are we relevant? And believe me, even though I'm of a certain age, we have much younger people coming too. They care more about relevance and justice work than the age of whoever's leading.
Billy, I think that is so accurate in terms of relevance. I think the other thing is you attract who you are. And at least for me, let me talk about in my context, right? So I am 50 now. When I started the church, I was 35. Right. But I started attracting who I was. I started attracting those who were 35, 36, 37, into that age range. But of course, when I started the church, my mother came along with me. Well, she's 35 years older than me. So she started attracting older people, right? It wasn't, so you're not the person that's going to attract the people. It's people in your congregation. Sheep begat sheep. At least that's what they told us, right? And so it's people in your congregation that start getting people in targeted areas. Of course, they brought their children. That's how we got a bunch of young people. And that's kind of like how we were able to congeal together and become family. People started bringing people in different age groups that fit into different places. We started getting young people and young adults, and they just started growing from there. So.
Thank you so much. I do want to say that a lot of this has to do with the knowing who you seek to serve. And this now, I'm from my position, I'm speaking to all of you wondering, how does this apply to my congregation? We've done a lot of research about who that is, but you have to do your research about who is in your community, who do you seek to serve, and how do you attune your response to those people? If your whole congregation revolves around upholding several committees, then those are the people that you serve. If you want to be in conversation with your community, you have to meet and know your community. And this is reflective of many of the things that we teach and say. And if you have questions about how to do that, feel free to email. And I'm happy to be in conversation with you and direct you to other people who can help your conference and beyond. So I do want to say that part outright. Aaron, I see you poised to add in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and echo what you just said. I think the key is so often when we think of church, we think of the safety of stained glasses and four walls. And I think the truth is we can't be relevant. We won't have full impact in creating changed lives and changed communities unless we go beyond those four walls. To shake hands, get to know, get to understand what the needs are. And that's where, we become a living and breathing entity outside. So we serve those inside. There was inward healing, but then there's also outward work and mission that we're able to do to spread the love of Christ. Even if folk never step foot in the church, we're able to be a part of something that's greater than what we're doing. Do we have any other questions, Chris? I want to take one more if we have time for it. We don't have it. Look at that.
I was just going to say that so much of this is really getting to know the community you seek to serve, and that's reflective in a lot of the questions that we've had. So the other thing that, for those of you who are feeling the call and attentive to the Spirit moving for your leadership, what I would suggest that you do is breathe into the Spirit and really listen. Really listen to God, because, as so many on this call and this program have said, it's going to be hard. You will find blocks every path, and they are too gracious to say this, but I will say this, that oftentimes those blocks are even within our systems. And we are doing the best we can to make sure we are in relationship, we are adjusting, and we are also moving at the speed of that which we have access to move. So be creative and know that, God has a call for you in this work. That call, God's call, is in conversation and covenant with these institutions. And God's call is in conversation with you. And there's this odd tension of that's present there. And my colleague Elizabeth Dilley, who leads MESA, and I speak about the necessary tension between the work of ministers and the work of congregations. So having said all that, as you have continuing questions, you are welcome to reach out to Reverend Dr. Aaron Wade and or to me. I'm Reverend Dr. Chris Davies. We lead the faith. We are on the Faith Info team at the national setting, and we will help get you to whom may be well and better equipped to answer your questions one way or another. And if this program has meant something to you, if you've experienced some hope, if you've seen a pathway forward or carried out an idea that will help you to move your mission in the world, please consider donating to the national setting through the annual fund by texting UCC to 41444, and that will help us continue this ongoing work of bringing you these conversations and equipping churches. I can't let this moment go by without saying, if you have donated to strengthen the church on or around Pentecost each year, these are some of the people that you have supported in various ways across their ministries. So when it comes around to Pentecost and you're wondering about strengthen the church, you can even find this recording and play up some of these stories in your worship. So thank you for your continued support. I want to let you know that on Thursday of this week, we will not be gathering for a webinar. We will be attentively holding space for all that has come before in conversation with CDC guidelines and various ways of being safe to protect not only ourselves, but our future generations. And as always, I encourage you to do the research of the land where you are and know who was there before you were there. If you are settled, if you are associated with settlers, if you have been brought here beyond your ancestors have been brought here without consent, or if you are associated with Indigenous communities yourselves, be in relationship with them. This week is ongoing, very difficult. And in the middle of all of this, there is just abundant grief for the ways we wish this week could have been. So be gentle with yourselves, beloved of God. Reverend Dr. Aaron Wade, will you do us the deep privilege of praying us into the rest of our day?
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Chris. So let me say to everyone, thank you to our panelists, and thank you for viewing this. Let us humble ourselves before the divine. God, we thank you for this opportunity to sup together, to fellowship together, to share ideas, to hear the journeys, experiences, and paths of those who trailblaze, who started ministries for your glory and for your honor. Now, God, I'm asking that you would take the seeds that were planted through today's conversation and that you would allow your Holy Spirit to move like never before, that you would allow your love, that you would allow your justice to come up in every corner of this world, oh God. I'm asking that the seeds that were planted on today would start wildfires of churches, God, coming up in bars and in clubs and in coffee shops and in untraditional, unorthodox places so that you could live and be with your people at every juncture. God, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this season of thanksgiving and gratefulness. Things may not be how we would like them to be, but God, we're thankful because you're with us. We're thankful because we still have. We ask, God, that you would take us from this place and let us move forward and help to be change agents in this world, creating a just world for all. God, we love you. We thank you for loving us so much and calling us in such a time as this. It's in the name of the one who set the captives free, we pray. And everyone that agrees, say amen.